I welcome your family to today's family support group. A question that seems very familiar, a question that I'm sure most of you have asked yourself, a question that you struggle with. I think the biggest challenge as loved ones and family, the biggest challenge that we experience supporting our loved ones in their recovery is that we do not understand why can't they just stop, and I thought today I would try and answer the question, why don't they stop? Why aren't they able to stop? And if I talk about science today, I'm talking about science in a very philosophical way. I'm talking about science as a person that works with people that are addicted. I'm talking about science as a person that has experienced these things myself, being in recovery. So I hope that by the end of this family support group session, we'll have some form of understanding. We're not scientists, but at least we'll understand it. Maybe we can stop asking why can't they stop and ask ourselves how can we help them to stop. Okay. All loved ones, friends and family at some point, as they watch their loved ones struggle with addiction, will ask this important question. For example, a husband goes to work, um, comes back at around 4 p.m., finds his two kids outside playing, but something seems abnormal because the house is quiet and he's wondering what's going on. He sits in the car, waits to see if the kids will come to him or if the wife will come out of the house and come welcome him, from coming back from work. Maybe a backstory. The wife, 6 months ago, ended up in rehab. She was very remorseful. She had a drinking problem. She was very remorseful. And so she's back home. She's been sober for about 6 months now. She's been doing her meetings. She's been trying really hard. And so this day when the husband comes back, of course, as people with loved ones, if we don't see anything normal, we wonder what's going on. Am I in any form of trouble? Is there something I'm missing? So he moves around the house, gets out of the car, moves around the house. He goes, tries to look for the wife. He can't find the wife. The wife is not in the kitchen. The wife is not in the bedroom. The wife is not in the garden. So he's starting to get concerned. He tries to call the wife. The phone is not ringing. So he goes back to the kids, the ones that were playing in the yard, and says, "Where's your mother?" And the kids shrug their shoulders. They don't know where the mother is. One is 4, the other one is 2. He doesn't know where the wife is. And it's a concern because most times when she has disappeared, it's been because she's been drinking. So he finally goes to the laundry room, and that's where he finds the woman, the wife, on the floor, passed out with bottles of alcohol. He's frustrated. He goes to her, shakes her awake, and asks her, "How can you do this? I told you the next time you do this, I'm going to divorce you. How can you? Why did you do this again? Look at you. You've been drinking. You promised me you would never, ever drink again. Look at you." She gets in touch with some feelings. She feels embarrassed. She feels guilt. She's there. She can't believe it. She has a shock on her face, and you can see it. The husband leaves, goes and gets the kids, puts them in the car, and drives away. Now, the wife, with some remorse, she's done wrong. Yes, she did promise. As she feels all this remorse and the guilt, she gets in touch with some anger, with some resentment. No, he can't take my kids. These are my children. He can't. There's no way he can. She goes, opens the cupboard, gets another bottle of wine and drinks it. Why? Why? Just 10 minutes ago, the husband threatened to divorce her for drinking. What insanity is that? That even 10 minutes later, she wants to drink. And in order for us as normal human beings who, you, probably the family, loved ones, in order for you to make sense of what you're experiencing, you must find some rational explanations. So some of the things that we'll say, maybe it's me, maybe This woman or this wife, my wife is drinking because I am doing something to her. Can you imagine that children blame themselves for their parents drinking? Sometimes wives blame themselves for their spouse because in order for us to justify the behavior that doesn't make sense, we need to make some rationalization. And sometimes we say things like, maybe it's the stress from the work. Maybe it's the way I raised him or raised her. It must be me because he wants to hurt me. Or he is just a selfish human being who doesn't care. Why can't he stop? For example, this woman knew the consequences. Why couldn't she stop even after 10 minutes? And that's what that's what we're going to try and answer today. Because one of my favorite books, and I really, really love the big book. I love the fact that as people that work in this industry, we've embraced the 12 steps. I think the 12 steps have really shaped the way we do recovery. And so back in the 1935, when they published this book, they had a notion, and some of the things they said that how many times have people said to us, I can't take it or leave it alone. Why can't he? Why don't you drink like a gentleman or quit? That fellow can't handle his alcohol. Why don't you try beer and wine? Lay off the hard stuff. He must have really little wick. Otherwise, how couldn't he not stop? If he could stop, he could stop if he wanted to. She's such a sweet girl. So these are all things that people like us, normal human beings, look when they see an addict. This is the assumption. These are the remarks they made. These are commonplace observations on drinkers, which we hear all the time. But behind these observations is a world of ignorance and misunderstanding. We see that these expressions refer to people whose reactions are very different from ours. I am an alcoholic. I know that when I drink beer, when I drink something, when I used to at least, the feeling that I would get would be different from normal human beings. Would be, you know, for example, I was talking to a friend of mine and I asked him, when do you remember the first time you drank? And they said, um, the first time, I don't really remember the first time I drank. I know the first time I drank. It was memorable, it was magical. It was so even when I was going through consequences, I did not want to stop. No, I did not want to stop. So moderate drinkers have little trouble in giving up liquor entirely if they have a good reason for it. They can leave it alone or they cannot. Then we have the type of person who is a hard drinker, and people like us. He may have the habit badly enough to gradually impair him physically and mentally. It may cause him even to die a few years before his time. But if a sufficiently strong reason, ill health, you fall in love, you change your environment, or the warning of a doctor becomes operative, this man can also stop or moderate, although he may find it difficult and may end up needing medical attention. But what about the real alcoholic? My assumption for this evening is that if you have a loved one in treatment, they are probably the real addict or the real alcoholic. It means that they've reached a stage where nothing is going to help them in terms of moderating, in terms of reason good enough. All they can do is to really abstain. So they're going to say that when a real alcoholic starts off, he may begin off at the beginning, at the start, where he's a moderate drinker. He may not become a continuous drinker or user, but at some stage of his drinking, he begins to lose control of his liquor consumption. Once he starts to drink, he is unable to stop. And I want us to note that a real addict or a real alcoholic, once they start, they are unable to stop. They want to stop, but they are unable to stop. Here is the person who puzzles you, especially loved ones, especially in their lack of control. He does absurd, incredible, tragic things while using. He is a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It means he has two characteristics. He has the person that he is when he's not drinking, and there's the character that comes out when he drinks. He is seldom mildly intoxicated. He is always more or less insanely drunk. His disposition while drinking may resemble his normal nature a little. He may be one of the most amazing human beings in the world, but when they drink, let him drink for a day, and he becomes disgustingly and even antisocial. And this was written, guys, in 1935. They probably didn't know what they were talking about, but they had an inkling. This was a group of alcoholics, and they had an inkling that I know sometimes I want to stop, but I cannot stop, and I cannot explain to you why I cannot stop. For myself, I have asked for myself, or I ask myself the same question. Why can't I stop? I never said it to anyone. I never said it out loud, but I knew it. If you asked me why couldn't I stop, I'll tell you, why would I stop? I have not lost any job. I have not killed anyone. I have gone to school. I have gotten an education. What do you mean I should stop? But inside, deep within me, I always wondered, why can I not stop? Because at the end of my addiction, towards the end, I wanted to stop. For 4 years, I wanted to stop. You can't imagine having the idea that I don't want to stop, but being unable to stop. I almost drove myself insane. Every day I would wake up and say, this is the last time I used. And it wouldn't be the last day. And I would wake up the next day with remorse and regret and shame and guilt and question my ability. So we are going to understand what is behind. How can I say I want to stop and be unable to stop? How can you ask your loved ones why aren't they able to stop and yet they are unable to stop? If that makes any sense. So in order to answer these questions, we're going to look at addiction as a disease. In 1935, the guys that wrote the previous pages that we just read, two drunks, Bill and Bob, who are the founders of AA, started to refer to alcoholism as a disease. They believed in this notion so much that they tried to sell this idea to health professionals. One doctor, Dr. Silkworth, who was really invested in helping drugs at the time, believed in this idea and said, yes, I agree with them. When you get the big book at the beginning, there's what they call the doctor's opinion. And the doctor's opinion, he says, yes, I agree with these guys. They could be onto something, The doctor's name was Dr. Silkworth. He was ostracized by them. The doctors did not believe that, they thought, he's just lenient with these guys that have really lost their will to drink. Doctors didn't believe the notion that addiction was a disease, but today modern science has vindicated the doctor and the drugs with evidence that indeed addiction is now recognized as a state, as a disease. One of the reasons why it was a struggle for addiction to be classified as a disease was the stigma and the shame that addiction comes with, the perception that people that use substance use disorders are weak or immoral or simply out to have a good time at the expense of society. Why should we believe that it's a disease? These guys make ruin, they damage people, they do that. Can you imagine in the early years of in the 70s or 60s, I know that there was a program, a US program, funded and governed and led by a Miss, a first lady, and the program was just say no, and that's where they started arresting addicts because they believe that, an addict can just say no. You can give an addict a beer and they can say, no, I don't want it just for today, and that has really turned out to be quite a difficult endeavor. That's why today people are a bit open and understanding to the fact that this could be a disease. Understanding that addiction impairs the brain in many important ways may reduce the stigma. What's more, a specific type of brain dysfunction may help to identify interventions and preventions. For example, we know that the earlier a person starts to experiment with drugs, the more easier they are more likely, the more they're likely to get addicted, because at that age, when they're still young, 16, 17, their brain is still being formulated. So because we know it's about the brain, the interventions and the help is really coming out and it's being helpful to the doctors. So most importantly, what is a disease? So if we say that addiction is a disease, what is a disease? A disease is a particular abnormal condition that negatively affects the structure or function of any part of an organism that is not due to any immediate external injury. So if I hit you in the eye, it's not, and your eye becomes swollen, it's not a disease. But if you wake up and your eyes is red and something is happening and it goes on, it's not immediate. So it means it's probably, and the abnormal condition of that your eye is red means that it is a disease. Diseases are often known as to be medical conditions associated with specific signs and symptoms. So one of the things that we experience is physical condition. As a physical condition is withdrawals. Withdrawals is what happens when you stop using after you have been using for a long time. That's a later stage symptom. It's not a cause. It's what happens if I drink for 10 years and then one day I wake up and I stop drinking. There's going to be a physical condition in form of withdrawals. I'm going to want physically, my body wants something, if any of you, if we tied any of you down and started giving you a dose of heroin every day, and then all of a sudden we stopped, you would go through physical pains. You would have a running stomach, you'd have sweats, you'd have something physical that can be seen that shows that you're missing something. And I'm sure most of you know that. And I will feel like I'm dying. Honestly, if you're going through withdrawals, if you've ever gone through withdrawals, it feels like you are dying. So even if you don't want to use, right? Even if you don't want to use and you know, it feels like you're dying and therefore you're going to use. You're going to use to relieve the pain that is coming as a result of withdrawals. Because actually you might die. Withdrawals will kill you. So that's the physical condition. But what we're most invested in today is looking at the chemical dependence. And why is that important? We know that people will go through withdrawals. They will be helped through the withdrawal process. They will be helped medically, and then they will be fine. Physically, they will not have any more physical withdrawals. You normal people, or normal people, as I like to say, once they are done with the physical condition, with the withdrawals, they will go and live happily ever after. But an addict, people that have addiction, they will go through that withdrawal process, helped, and they will stay a month without using, 2 months, 3 months, and they will do this again. They will go back to the drugs. Why? Even though they've gone through the withdrawals, even though they've been helped through the withdrawals, why would they go back to using the drugs again? And that's where the chemical dependency comes in. It was only the physical if it was only the physical dependency, you wouldn't have gone back to the drugs again. Unfortunately, most of our loved ones have gone through the physical that is really painful, and then 3 months, 2 weeks, whatever time, they have gone back to use drugs. If I did that, you would think it's insane, but it is true. It happens over and over and over again. It's important to understand the difference between a substance abuse and an addiction. According to the International Institute on Drug Abuse, addiction differs from substance abuse that it is a chronic disease that is incredibly difficult to control. Abuse of certain substances, such as alcohol or prescription drugs, can cause chemical changes in the brain that lead to addiction. I think it's very important for us to note of that when I abuse substances, beyond the physical addiction, I am messing with my brain. And if I mess with my brain, I am going to get addicted. Abuse of certain substances, such as alcohol or prescription drugs, can cause chemical changes in the brain that lead to addiction. So it's, yes, for sure, the symptoms, the physical symptoms are there. But most importantly, it's the physical brain. It's the damage that I've done to the brain that leads to the addiction. These changes compels one to keep using the substances that they're addicted to, no matter what the negative effects may be. We all know that not everyone that drinks a glass of wine or smokes a joint or it becomes addicted. We all know that. We all know people that use once in a while and have not become addicted. So I could abuse alcohol. We all know that there's some people that abuse alcohol for a long time, and then when there is a good enough reason, they are able to stop. They might even suffer from withdrawals, from physical withdrawals. But if there is a good enough reason, they'll be able to stop. That could be substance abuse, but it's not addiction. Addiction as a brain disease. An addicted person's impaired ability to stop using drugs has more to do with the deficits in the function of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is involved in the executive function. The prefrontal cortex has several important jobs like self-monitoring, like delaying reward and integrating whatever the intellect tells you. The difficulty also has to do, when I'm speaking, I'm using my prefrontal cortex. I am making a judgment, I am making decisions, this is in charge now. But there is what we call the midbrain. The midbrain, I don't know if you can see me, but it's somewhere in the back, inside there. And this is very, very ancient. The prefrontal cortex has had to evolve because values change over time, because decisions, because it has to adapt so that I can function in a society. I can adapt changes in my world and in my environment. But my midbrain is about survival. All it needs is for me to survive. It's more, how can we keep him safe? I'll give you an example. I have a niece that I really love and that I would die for. So I'm seated, for example, now, and my niece comes in the back and pokes me. When my niece pokes me, if I use my prefrontal cortex, I'm going to say, oh, I love her. She did it by accident. Therefore, she didn't intend to harm me. That is the one that is thinking is the prefrontal cortex. It is considering the values and the needs and the values, mostly the values that I have and the relationship that I have with my niece. But say, let's example, my niece comes and pokes me. When she pokes me, my midbrain, which is responsible for survival, overrides the prefrontal cortex and creates the compulsion to swing my hand because I want to survive. I am not thinking how much I love my niece. I'm not thinking how much I care about her. I'm just reacting. There's been a stimuli and therefore there has been a response. Can you guess what part of the brain drugs have an impact on? The midbrain. The midbrain is hijacked by drugs. So what happens is I tend to compulsively use drugs every time. Compulsively. Compulsively means without thought. It's like the way my niece poked me and I just turned and hit her. And once I hit her, I was guilty because now my prefrontal cortex came into play and I felt guilty and I felt remorseful and I was like, I'm sorry, I love you, I would never do this to you, oh, look at you, let me try and get you some help. Let me take you to a doctor. I'm really, really sorry. My prefrontal cortex is in charge now. 3 months down the road, my niece still pokes me and I compulsively hit her. I did not intend to hit her. No, I did not intend to. It's just that there was a stimuli and there was a response. I don't know if that makes sense, but we can take it further. Let's look at the husband at the bar. For example, this gentleman, he loves his wife. He calls and says, I'm sorry, but today I have to go meet a friend. There's this business opportunity that I have to go and do, but I'll be back at 7:30. I'll be back by 7:30 and I should be home then. And so the prefrontal cortex has explained, I'm going, this is important, this is business, I'm going to go, I'm just going to have one drink and maximum, and by 7:30, I should be coming home. The wife has nothing to get concerned about, she knows, okay, thank you for calling me, I'll see you later at 7:30. Now, this gentleman goes to meet the friend, now they're having the business meeting, he takes the first drink. Once he takes the first drink, he's thinking, I'm still on time. I'm still on time. I still have 30 minutes to go. Let me take another one. When he's taking the second drink, he realizes it is 7:30. Do you know what he thinks to himself? Oh shit, I'm already late, 7:30. Oh well, so I'm already late. She's going to get mad anyway, so I'll take another one. As the moment he takes the third and the fourth and the sixth, he's starting to think, oh, well, I should put off my phone. what happened was, and I want to emphasize this, that what happened was he did not have the intention to drink until 2 a.m. in the night. But the moment he started to have a drink, something compelled him to drink more beers. Did he lie to his wife that he was going to come back at 7:30? Of course not. And I want us to emphasize, I want to also emphasize this, that there's 3 stages in our addiction. There's the early stage. In the early stage, I can stop. If I'm not drinking, I am not compelled. In the early stage, you don't get compelled when you're not drinking. You can spend a year, you can spend 3 years without drinking and or without using, and you will not be compelled. In the second stage, yes, when you drink like this gentleman, something happens and you're compelled to have more. You compulsively react to the stimuli. In the third stage, that's where you will drink. You won't even, by that time, hopefully you've not lost your marriage, but at that time in the later stage, you drink all the time. It's all you do. You don't need a stimuli. You just keep drinking. That's the later stage. So this gentleman, we can see that he is in the early stages. He did not intend to lie his wife, but the moment he took a drink, he was compelled to have more alcohol. And of course, if he comes back to 2 a.m. at night, they'll have the discussion, and the discussion will be, you don't love me, you lied to me, and all of that stuff, like we saw at the beginning. So how do drugs affect the brain? While every drug affects the brain differently, most all addictive drugs interact with the brain pathway called mesolimbic reward system. The mesolimbic reward system extends from the ventral tegmental to the ventral stratum. And like I said earlier, we're going to talk about science, but it's important. It's important for us to understand, and that's why we're going into this in-depth science, that our loved ones haven't lied to us. Yes, they have, maybe to manipulate, but if they are addicted, and that's why they're in recovery, and that's why they're in treatment, it's beyond what we see. It's beyond the things that they say. It's beyond, it's more in-depth. And this is what the science of the brain in terms of addiction says, that the mesolimbic reward system extends from the ventral tegmental to the ventral stratum, reaching areas like the limbic system and the orbitofrontal cortex. Research suggests that all addictive substances activate the mesolimbic reward system in some way. This makes us associate the substance with a reward and produces urges to reuse the drug. Repeated and prolonged drug use causes physical changes in certain brain functions. These changes can be pervasive and persist long after the individual stops using drugs. The addicted brain is distinctively different from the non-addicted brain. So because neuroscientists will tell you that the more I do something in my brain, I am creating what we call pathways, neural pathways. And so they're saying that the after the effect is that they'll see different brain chemistries. The brain is distinctively, if I've been using for a long time, my brain has changed. If there's been chronic use of drugs, affects the brain at a molecular, cellular structure, and even a functional level. These are the changes in the brain: metabolic activity, receptor availability, gene expressions, and the responsiveness to emotional cues. So by this time, my brain is not really functional like normal human beings. And this is very important, because sometimes when someone says, I will not use again, they really mean it. They mean it. They don't want to use again, because now in that moment, maybe in that moment, the brain is working functionally, but we don't know how it will be in the next 1 or 3 or 2 months or 2 days or whatever it is. So how do the drugs affect the brain? Addiction relates to brain structure changes and functions, making it fundamentally a brain disease. When you first start using a drug, you may use it voluntarily, but after a prolonged use, however, you begin to seek and use it compulsively. And this behavior characterizes addiction: compulsively, without thought. Stimuli equals response. Because addiction is a consequence of fundamental changes in brain function, a primary goal of treatment must be to either reverse or compensate for those brain changes. You can affect brain changes through medications and behavioral therapies. And this is where treatment comes in, that with time and with engagement in therapy, the brain can be restructured. I've had people say that the brain is like a sponge, or the brain is like a muscle. It can be reworked over and over again. Um, so how do the specific drugs affect the drug? Okay, so let's look at the specific drug and how it impacts. So for example, alcohol acts all over the brain in many different pathways. It affects endorphins and dopamine. It affects glutamate and GABA, the two primary excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. It affects all kinds of ion channels. And how does cocaine? Cocaine is the exact opposite of alcohol. In this way, it does one specific thing, it does really effectively. It blocks the recycling of dopamine and other neurotransmitters like norepinephrine. And that enhances pleasure and enhances arousal and enhances movement. Marijuana. When you smoke marijuana, the whole brain is flooded with THC, and that causes the cell-to-cell communication in cells throughout the brain to be enhanced or to be exaggerated. And that's really fun because it seems like, wow, everything is so interesting. Everything is so beautiful. The music is so rich. The colors are so wonderful. The food is delicious. Everything at once is turned on. And that's not how the natural system should work. What's unfortunate is the brain does adapt to that, and it adapts by decreasing the number of sites that THC can have an effect on. So those sites downregulate, meaning they go away over time. And it doesn't take long. But the more you use and the more often you use, the less of these receptors there will be. When you take away the drug, things seem sort of lifeless and gray and maybe less interesting. So marijuana overstimulates you, and then when you don't have that marijuana, then it feels like, oh, something is missing. My life is boring. And then opiates make a user feel like they're not suffering. They are completely content, completely comfortable, completely well. That everything is okay the way it is. And I think that for that reason, they're also attractive, because often we don't experience that things are okay the way they are. So they are kind of a perfect antidote to suffering of any kind. Um, the problem is that if we reduce the suffering and we produce euphoria using opiates, the brain adapts. And so now we don't feel high and completely content with them. We just feel not sick and miserable. And when we take them away, we feel full of suffering, much more suffering than we started to begin with. So the brain produces its own type of suffering. And I think that most of you that have watched Vietnam movies or whatever it is, we know that a lot of American soldiers that went to the Vietnam War came back with an opiate problem. And one of the biggest characteristics was that they were, when they came back, they were really depressed, because when they were there in the actual suffering, they were not experiencing anything. It was like the aftermath of the war was more unbearable than the actual war. And because most of them were able to survive through that using the opiates that were readily available in Vietnam. And so last but not least, I think this is quite very important, because we've had dopamine and we don't know what dopamine is, and we know that the dopamine is there in our brain, so you've probably heard of dopamine as a pleasure chemical. It's been associated with addiction a lot. Experts are still studying exactly how dopamine, a neurotransmitter, works in the context of addiction. Many believe it trains your brain to avoid unpleasant experiences and seek out pleasurable ones. It's this role in reinforcing your brain's quest for pleasure that leads many to associate dopamine with addiction. But it's not that simple. While dopamine plays a role in addiction, this role is complex and not fully understood. But what we know so far is that dopamine is a motivator. While dopamine isn't the sole cause of addiction, its motivational properties are thought to play a role in addiction. Remember, the reward center in your brain releases dopamine in response to pleasurable experience. This part of your brain is closely linked to memory and motivation. Most addicts, when you ask them, do you remember the first time you used? They remember that clearly. And what happens is we tend to always pursue that great memory, because as we can see, the first time you use drugs, probably you got the biggest surge of dopamine in your body, and you're always trying to evaluate that. You're trying to relive that memory. But unfortunately, as we've seen, the more you use, the more tolerance you have, and the more the drug doesn't work. So you try to increase it. The more you increase, the more you get physically addicted. The more you get physically addicted, the more you use, the more it impacts your brain. The more it impacts your brain, the less decision you're going to be able to make, because the brainstem, the midbrain, is now taking over the part of your brain that makes executive function. So it's quite important for us to remember that dopamine is memory and motivation. Generally speaking, okay, so yeah. Generally speaking, when you experience a positive sensation and dopamine is released into the pathways of the reward center, your brain takes note of. And this is how the memory works. What triggered the sensation? How? Why did I feel that great? What substance was it? Was it a behavior? What type of food was it? Any cues, because I need to remember that. Any cues from my environment that can help me to find it again. Did you experience that at night? What else were you doing? Were you with certain persons? Were you exposed to those environmental cues? You will begin to feel the same drive to seek out that same pleasure. That this drive can be incredible, powerful, creating an urge that's hard to control. Keep in mind that this process doesn't always involve harmful substances or activities. Eating good food will also trigger, dopamine that will lead to memory formation, um, having sex, creating art, and a range of other things that trigger similar responses from your brain's reward center. Dopamine plays a role in developing tolerance in the context of drugs. Tolerance refers to the point at which you stop feeling the effects of a drug to the same degree that you used to, even though you're consuming the same amount of drug. If you develop a tolerance to a substance, you'll need to use more to feel its effects. Dopamine plays a role in this process. Consistent drug use eventually leads to addiction. The brain tries to solve this problem in two ways. So the more you use, what you've done, we have dopamine naturally in our brain. So the brain is trying to rescue you. It's like, what's going on? This man is manufacturing his own stuff. The brain will say, okay, he's getting it from somewhere else, so I do not have to create it anymore. So the brain stops creating its own dopamine. That's why we end up having what we call depression, or if you've seen someone new, sometimes you see how unhappy they are because the brain has decreased dopamine production. Or when the brain tries to rescue you, it reduces dopamine receptors. And when it reduces dopamine receptors, it means that even though you have the dopamine in your mind, but it's not there, so you have to use more. So we see that because we are abusing, or because we are addicted, we are doing all this damage in our brain, and therefore it's going to need help. It's going to either need abstinence, or it's going to need therapy, or it's going to need a lot of help in order to restructure back. Either change results in the substance having less of an effect due to a weaker response by the brain's reward center. Still, the craving to use remains. It just takes more of the drug to satisfy it. So I want to talk about the memory in closing. I know that when I was in treatment myself, there was, I remembered the first time I used drugs. It was memorable. It was amazing. I remembered that feeling so well. But the more I used, it became a faraway experience. It became farther and farther and farther. But so this is what my reality was, and I hope that most of you can see me. My reality was bad. It was ugly. It was, I was going through the roughest and most painful of experiences. But I didn't want to see this. So I kept hoping for the memory of that experience, of my first hit and my first experience. And when they told me to go to meeting, I was thinking, what meetings? I want to feel good. I don't care what I do. I just want to feel good. I don't want to use drugs, but I want to experience this amazing memory that I once had. So when they told me to do my step work, it was painful. I didn't come to rehab to feel pain. I came to rehab to feel good. Good for me is the addiction. So and I remember one thing specifically is that my counselor asked me to to go to a meeting, and I was like, I'm not going to those that meetings where people talk about painful experiences. And I was quite egotistical because if there was anyone that knew a lot about drugs, I knew a lot about drugs, but I knew nothing about recovery. So I knew that if I go to meetings, they are going to raise my pain, and I don't want to feel the pain. I'm in rehab to feel good. And they didn't end there. I remember that incident where I said, if you don't go to a meeting, then you won't have your nightmares. Oh, and I wanted my nightmares. So anyhow, I went to the meeting. It was painful and excruciating and all of that stuff. And when I was leaving rehab, they told me I have to go to 90 meetings. 90, not just one, 90 meetings. I could not believe these people. They wanted me to experience pain 90 times. I could not believe it. But I went. I don't know why I went. I went. And what happened was that even though I was looking for the pleasure, the happiness, the excitement that was memory of my past and my using, I started realizing that it was bad. I started realizing that my reality was bad because I would be at those meetings and these guys would talk about my pain. They were not talking about themselves, they were talking about themselves, but I could relate to the pain. And eventually, that memory became a distant memory, honestly. And all I could see was the pain that my addiction was causing. And if I could face my pain realistically, I could try and solve it. And the only way I could solve it was by staying clean and sober. So that's what treatment does. Despite the damage in your loved one's brain and the functioning of their brain, we keep that pain fresh, not intentionally to harm them, but we try to show them this is how bad your life is. Yes, you have this memory that it was amazing, but it's not amazing anymore. That's why you're here. And we work through this, and then they work through the step one, and then they work through the step two, and then they work through a step three, and they work through step four, and then they start to realize, oh my God, I can have freedom by just allowing that maybe I have a problem. Thanks. If you have any questions, please, you can post them in the chat group. Thanks, and thanks for being patient with us. I know we started off on a bad patch today, but thanks for being patient with me, and thanks to everyone that has engaged in. Thank you.